Okay, so where we left off last was really we had our multi-resolution modifier applied to our object. And right, remember your ship, whatever you're sculpting on, particularly if you've built a good base mesh already, and you're not going to have a separate mesh to transfer normal maps from because you can't do that, it's a good idea to have the UVs already unwrapped, right? It's kind of one of those things where unless you're really just sculpting and then you're going to unwrap another one and have separate different models, we're going to kind of streamline the process and just make a normal map for multi-resolution, which will streamline, make things a little easier for us. But generally, particularly for the way we've been doing it, you should have your model done and your UVs done, and then we can do the sculpting pass to do the details, right? But remember, you do need the multi-resolution modifier, so, Blue Wrench, there is a modifier called multi-resolution, but you have to also subdivide that, right? There's actually a subdivide button in that modifier that adds your actual subdivision levels, giving you, well, multiple resolutions, right? Because that's really what subdividing does, right? It takes your mesh, takes each quad, subdivides it into 4 smaller quads. You do it again, it takes those smaller quads, subdivides them into more, and you get more polygons, and you can do more detail with that. Remember, though, it does use a similar algorithm, or the same kind of algorithm that subdivisional surfaces do, so it kind of averages the vertices at the corners, so that kind of sucks them in to round the shape off, so it gives a curvature. The multi-resolution modifier is useful for that. You should subdivide a couple times to have enough to do this. A million or more should be good for what we're going to do, but the more polygons you can do, the more detail you can get. It also does depend on how well your computer can handle that. And like I said, we know that our computers aren't always the best, and our devices aren't always the most powerful. So kind of do what you can with what your computer can run, right? So multi-resolution's on. And remember, you also, of course, it's probably a good idea to be in sculpting workspace, right? And it's a good idea to be in sculpt mode, right? Remember, that's 5. The quick key for sculpt mode is 5. But sculpting workspace is here as well. And usually when you switch to sculpting workspace, your sculpting tools are on, right? We're primarily using a lot of the top ones here, right? And a little bit of the masking ones down here. So the blue ones are the ones we're going to stick with a lot, and then we'll do a little bit of masking here momentarily with these ones down here. But for right now, I do want to kind of do a little more with maybe some rivets here and there, and a few more things with lines, and then I'll show you how to curve mask. And then I'll show you how to sculpt with an image if you want to, right? You probably don't need to do that for your ship, and it's kind of not required at all for the sculpting part of your ship, but I would like to see some masking and like things like these ones, right? That's kind of really what I'd like to see in your sculpt. If you don't want to use images to add like scratch marks or dents, that's okay. I just want to make sure you guys get to see it a little bit as an option, right? These are not meant to be exhaustive of everything you do with sculpting and modeling, right? This is a high school class, and you only have it for a term, and it's only focusing on hard surface modeling, and we really only have 2 projects, so I teach you a lot, but there's a lot that I don't teach you, right? There's a lot that's kind of, left out that you could do, because there's only so much you can learn in a term, right? So remember, I'm going to go back up to my my sculpt draw, the regular sculpt draw brush. It's the very top one, right? That's kind of a good default brush, right? The draw. This is one I like, and it can work pretty well for your rivets, right? So you just want to make sure your kind of top brush is turned on. Make sure your symmetry's on as well, right? Remember, over here, in the right top corner, there is X for your symmetry, right? And that'll turn it on at least for the X-axis. Technically, you can turn it on for all of them. You can even do radial symmetry, which only really works in certain instances, right? It'd be really, really cool at some point if they actually could make the radial symmetry work with your cursor position. That'd be really awesome. Blender doesn't quite do that yet, but hopefully maybe they'll eventually add that. That'd be really, really cool. Because it could make doing some details on those really, really easy. But as of right now, at least I don't know how to do that. And I've got to know Blender pretty well, but there is some other controls in here. But for us, the default X is going to be fine. Just make sure that's on. And of course, I want to maybe add a little more rivets kind of in here. Not even rivets, but like maybe little divots like these, kind of little holes. Maybe to kind of add some details to our engines, right? So what I could do is I, of course, go to brush mode, right? There is these menus right up here when you're in your sculpt tools, right? Because there's radius, that's the size of your brush. There's strength, that's the amount it's going to sculpt, right? So There is a pressure sensitivity button right here, but that's really if you're using a Wacom pen and tablet, which I use at home, but when I'm here at school, we don't really have those, so I just use a mouse, right? So that doesn't really matter if that's on or off right now, but that is something you can turn off and on when you're using a Wacom tablet and pen. And it can do some cool stuff. It gives you some pressure control. So in this case, I'm going to turn negative on also, because remember, you have this plus and this minus. Plus generally will sculpt your mesh away from the surface, outward. Negative will push it inward. Remember, control is the shortcut for inversing those functions. However, control doesn't turn negative on. It inverses it. So if you have negative on, control will turn positive on. If you have positive on, right, the plus, control will turn negative on, right? So control is really just inverting what your sculpting is doing, right? But I'm going to go to the brush menu here, and there is a slider called Hardness. And if you turn this up, it'll make your rivets that you're going to paint harder. So if you want softer rivets, leave the hardness at 0. If you want something more like what we already have, turn that hardness up, right? That kind of has the edges be harder, right? I want to go a couple over to stroke, right? And the nice thing is we already have some videos on this, right? And in stroke, remember the stroke method by default is set to space. And that is a good default to have on a lot of the time. But remember, we can click on that menu to pull down, and there is drag dot. Drag dot. And with that on, and my brush set to negative, and having a bit of brush hardness, that's going to allow me to go in here to these engine parts, and I can add these little kind of bits here. Now, because I don't really get a radial symmetry function to work on this, I kind of go opposite, right? I put one there, and then I put it on the opposite side, right? And then I kind of go to this one, and I put it on the opposite side here. And this will kind of let you get more of a proper kind of spacing for these, right? So see how it does a pretty good job of quickly mimicking kind of a radial symmetry effect, right? It's just a little trick. Until they have a feature that supports that, which they kind of have, but it doesn't quite work like this on a really localized area. It'd be awesome if you could use cursor with that, but at least I've never gotten it to work. But you can kind of go in there and put those in there like that, right? So I just found that's a cool little trick when you want to do these kinds of things. Zoom in here a little bit. So if I want to get like a kind of a radial symmetry effect, I just do it manually by kind of pulling there, and then one on the exact opposite side. And then I'll kind of do it here, so I'm kind of breaking it into quarters, if you will, right? And it's rarely ever going to be perfect, but you can get it pretty good and pretty close, right? So I kind of focus on kind of doing it opposites, and you see it does a pretty good job of breaking those into quarters and looking pretty nice. So it's just kind of a cool little, just a trick, right, I've learned to get the radial symmetries to look pretty good, right? Just focus on kind of opposites, and it makes it easier to kind of find a middle, and get it kind of started and going. So until they actually have a proper radial symmetry that would work in a localized area like this, like I said, they have potential for it, but they don't quite have it. That'll work as a pretty good trick. And I find it works pretty well, and it gets a pretty good result. All right. So see how, once again, you can use that drag dot to kind of do some neat little effects like that, right? It's kind of a neat, cool thing you could do just to kind of add these little engine bits there, right? If I wanted to, I could do something similar on the outside here. It's kind of up to you on what you want to do with that, though. All right. And man, there's some stuff I could show you with, like, that I can't. It's just we're not going to have enough time to. I can show you stuff with face sets and inflate. That's really cool, but it's just too much. All right, so that's good for drag dot. I just want to kind of add a little more detail there. Thought that'd be cool to add. So in this case, maybe I could add a little bit of detail here and kind of maybe a little more line detail there. So in this case, I'm going to leave my, I'm going to turn my stroke back to space because I want to kind of get my, I'll go back to brush and I'll turn the hardness to 0 and then set that back to plus. Just so my regular draw brush is kind of more to the default. I want to use the draw sharp brush right below it. Now draw sharp already has negative on. It's supposed to push in, right? You also see when I go to brush that, you know, these defaults are there, but you'll see something fall off. It's set to sharper instead of smoother. You can actually control that, and that kind of makes it pinch inward, right? So fall off actually has some presets. If you want it to be a pretty smooth shape, you can do that. If you want it to be sharp, you can do that, right? So there's some cool fall offs as well as just sharpness, hardness, or pinch controls, right? So draw sharp by default is already set to negative, and it kind of is a sharper thing automatically because of that sharper fall off. And in this case, all I really need to do then is just go to stroke, switch space stroke method to line, right? So we have line on. And then I can just easily go back in here, make my brush smaller. Right, remember the left and right brackets are good quick keys for that. But also S kind of is a quick key to control that as well, right? So you can actually use S to control the radius. I personally have always just liked the right and left bracket keys, right? So you have a couple of quick keys to it. Also, there is an actual button for it, right? There's a radius slider right here, just like there's a strength slider. So you have these all right in there. I just want a smaller line. I can just put some lines back through here, right? Actually, maybe a little bit bigger than that. Remember, Control-Z still undoes, right? Control-Z is always undo. I'm just going to maybe put a few lines back here. I'm not going to put as many as I had on the other one. Just get kind of a few back there. Maybe do a few kind of right here. Right, it might be kind of neat to kind of put a couple on this engine part here. Bezier line stroke really just does exactly what it says it's going to do. It does a line, right? And you have different cool brush presets like draw sharp, which automatically kind of creates a gouge, right? The crease one is actually a bit more subtle, so it's better for doing more subtle wrinkles and forms. This one's if you want it kind of more sharp, draw sharp instead of crease. Crease is a kind of more subtle version of that. We said we could do some kind of just neat stuff like these things, right? So there's some cool things you could do with these tools, right? If I wanted to, we could even kind of maybe add a few line strokes here. Maybe put one there, and then kind of one there. Just kind of do a few here. There we go. Then, of course, I can go over to this side and maybe get a little bit here as well. Remember, there is, if you go to Edit Preferences, because you'll notice this is kind of working for me, and you go to Navigation, you can actually turn Orbit Around Selection on, right? I've pointed this out a few times, and I'll point it out right now, but that is in Edit Preferences, not add-ons, because that's where you can turn your add-ons on, but if you go to Navigation, right, there's an option called Orbit Around Selection that you can turn on. And what that does is that makes your camera rotate, right? Orbit really just is another way to say camera rotate. It lets your camera rotate around whatever's selected automatically, which is really cool. And that works for shaping, regular selections, but it also works for sculpting and painting, right? So you'll notice when I go in here to sculpt, my camera rotates already around where I last sculpted. So that orbit around selection is actually really cool. And like I said, it works not only for regular selections for modeling, but it actually works on sculpting and painting also. So it's kind of a neat little function there to have, to turn on, if you want to use it. And I'm just kind of doing some cool little detailing here. If I want, I could do a little bit more line work down here, maybe a quick line across there. Maybe get it more from the bottom, so it'll be a little more straight. There we go. And you see how this line stroke can be really cool at doing certain kinds of details to your ship, right? So keep that in mind, right? I'm just getting creative. I'm playing around with it, just trying to show you these tools. But line stroke, right? It's one of your many strokes. I can go back to space for that one. And that was really the only adjustment we made on that one, was that. But just neat things you could do with that, right? The last thing we wanted to talk about again was masking. Now, if I scroll down, right, 'cause remember there's all these brushes here on the side, there is a scroll bar here that you could drag down, right? But also your scroll wheel actually works for this, right? We usually don't use the scroll wheel in software unless we're doing something like this, right, where we actually want to scroll up and down some menus. So if I put my cursor over the sculpt tools and I use the scroll wheel, it actually scrolls up and down. way down here, there is a brush that looks like a sphere with a brush, but also it's kind of got like gray and a white, right? Like a white little swoop right there. That's your mask tool. Now, make sure it's set to strength 1, which I do. Plus will paint the mask. Negative will unpaint the mask. So if you hold down Control, you can actually unpaint your mask. Now, you can use any of your strokes with this, right? You can even go into the stroke menu and use regular space, but use stabilized stroke. And what that does, it just makes the stroke a little more clean, right? And so I can kind of paint there a little bit, then kind of go up here. And I'll usually stop, and then I'll kind of move my cursor back. And you see I can kind of paint a pretty clean little panel part there, right? I can do it back here as well. So stabilized stroke can be a cool way to make a regular stroke a little bit smoother, right? It kind of has this line follow along it that just kind of cleans up the stroke a little bit. And it can make it pretty easy to get some pretty clean, just manual mask painting without that curve. Right? You see I can kind of just stop and then turn it around to go to a different area. Now, it does go a bit slower than the regular paint stroke does. So usually when I don't want it anymore, I'll turn it off, but that's in the stroke menu. And then I can just go right back in here, and I just kind of fill in the rest of that stroke. There we go. Technically, see, Mask does have a fill mask option, but it kind of fills in the whole thing. So it's not quite going to do what you think it's going to do, right? At least I've never seen anybody use it to do this properly. So for me, it's usually you kind of paint it to give you your kind of outline, and then you kind of just fill it in manually. But remember, you have a regular paintbrush that's actually quite good at allowing you to kind of paint a large panel shape. But remember, masking works based on the fact that you're painting the area you don't want to work with. So this kind of dark gray area is an area you can't sculpt with, right? If I go up back to my regular sculpt tools and I sculpt, so it doesn't do anything on the dark gray area, but then it starts to sculpt on the regular non-masked area. So usually I paint a mask because it's easier to paint the mask like this and then invert that mask, right? There is a mask menu in Blender, and there is Invert Mask, Control-I. And now you can see that everything but that area that I want to inflate is masked. So it's often easier to paint the mask and then invert it, because usually you're not going to want to. Usually you're going to want to just kind of mask off a small area to do work too, right? So oftentimes you actually paint the mask and then invert it to get the effect. Now if I scroll down again to these bottom ones, because there's a lot here, put your cursor over, right, the tools, scroll wheel down, you'll see way down here is one called Mesh Filter. And it kind of looks like a ball with a box and then kind of a blue squiggly shape. If I click on that, you'll see the default filter type is inflate. There are actually more than just inflate, but that's what we're going to use it for. But basically, the default's fine, and then we just left-click drag. And what that does is it basically moves those polygons that aren't masked out along the normal direction. And this could be a really cool way to add panels and creases, right? You can use masking for this. Of course, there is a clear mask, Control-A, which will clear it. And then the last little thing I'll do is I'll just go back to my regular mask, right? That first one we were using, it's up here higher, right? It's that mask with the kind of white shape there and the brush. And remember, we can go to stroke method, and pick the very bottom one. It's right below line. It's called curve. It's called curve. Now, when you turn curve on, you need to tell it to draw a curve, right? So I turn the method on, and then there's options here, and there's a button called draw curve. So I click on that, and I now should be able to come in here then, hold down Control, right? You need to hold down Control, left-click drag, and it makes your first point and gives you handles. I can then keep holding down Control, left-click drag again. You see how it makes a new point, but also lets you drag these handles out. And of course, this is based on the view, right? So if I want, I can go back and I grab that triangle, move it to there. See how you have these green handles. So you can actually move the points that you've created by grabbing the kind of pinkish triangle. And then there's these handles that are green squares that let you kind of control the curvature. It's what we call a Bezier curve. It's got these handles to control the curvature. Now at this point, I've selected the last curve the last point I created. So if I hold down Control and left-click drag, I can make a new point. And then I can make a new point back here. I'll kind of move that a little more towards the center there. And remember, you can left-click drag on these green handles. You can left-click drag on the kind of pink points. And this will allow you to play with that curvature. And this can kind of give you a slightly more precise, clean way to get really interesting curves. Now, in this case, I have to hit Enter to do the mask. And you see how it actually paints the mask, but it's a little wide. So Control-C for undo. And I'm going to turn my radius to be like, say, 10. Right? So your radius controls that. The smaller the radius, the smaller the mask when you hit Enter. And there you go. You see I've got a much smaller mask. Now, because we're doing this in mask, I can move on now, right? I can leave that and say, hey, let's kind of maybe do a little more work here. I can use the curve I already have, because this curve is based on the view. It's not actually on the surface. So I can left-click drag on that kind of point there, bring it over, left-click drag on that pinkish triangle. If I find I've got too many points, I can click on one of the triangles and hit Delete, and it'll get rid of that point. Right? So I can easily come in here, kind of get that point lined up with this mask, grab these handles. Remember, these handles, the green squares are your handles that let you kind of control the shape. So I can move the pink triangles are the actual points. These green handles control the curvature of this shape. So see if I grab on one of the pink triangles, I can kind of move it around. I grab on these green handles, I can control the curvature of it. And then I can hit Enter for that one, and it kind of makes a new little mask there. Then if I wanted to, I could do kind of one last one here. But the nice thing is once you already have a curve created, right, you just move it around. Now, if you want to get rid of that curve, go to the stroke, and you see you can click on the X, and that curve is no longer there. I could draw a new curve. So draw a curve. And remember, the way you draw a curve, and this is based on the view, hold down Control, left-click drag, that creates that point there, but by dragging, you create the handles. And then I'll Control, left-click drag here to create a new point. Control, left-click drag here to create a new point. And then maybe one there, Control, left-click drag. So when you Control, left-click drag, it will make the point where you click, but by continually dragging with the Control down, it drags out these green handles. And now that I've got this started, you can see how I can kind of grab this handle, and I can bring it here a little bit more. And actually, that's the wrong handle. We'll kind of bring this back down. See, I can move the point around by left-click dragging on the triangle. I can left-click drag on the handle to control the curvature. You see I can kind of sharpen some of those curves up a little bit. And it's just a neat way to get you some neat control over a curve. Hit Enter, and it creates that mask. And I'm just going to go back to stroke and hit X to get rid of it. And now I've got this neat kind of little extra detailing here. I can go to Mask, Invert Mask. I can go back to the kind of inflate, right, the mesh filter, which is that kind of ball with the square, and it's got like the blue squiggly shape. And I can just left-click drag in to inflate inward, right? Of course I can inflate outward, but if you left-click drag to the left, it'll inflate in. If you drag to the right, it'll inflate out. So inflating can go positive or negative. You just got to drag it left or right to do it. But once again, we inverted the mask because it's a lot easier to paint the mask and then invert it so that everything else is masked. Because remember, masking itself makes it so that you can't work with those. But it's just a lot easier to paint the mask and then invert it. Instead, inflate is a really cool way to kind of get these details in there. And of course, I can go mask, clear mask. Remember, there is Control I and Control A to do that. And you see that's just added some cool details to this, right? Some cool details to that. Now, if I briefly did want to add a little bit of detailing with an image, you would just go back to your regular sculpt tool, right? The draw sharp at the very top. I'm going to go down to the red checkerboard down here, because this is how I add an image in. New. That brings this up. I can hit open. This is something, if you guys don't do it, don't worry about it. I just wanted to kind of have a couple minutes to have it in a video for you guys, right? I'm going to go to desktop, because I think I have a couple of stencils here I could just use to show off. Is it in there? Yeah. All right. And remember, you can actually change to from lists to thumbnails. And I'm not sure if any of these is going to be really good at scratch marks, but it'll be enough to show off the tool, right? Maybe that metal kind of work. So click on that, open image up, and I've loaded this picture in. So just like with texture painting, you can go to texture here, and you see the texture is already available, but you can always click here to make sure it's the active one. And I can switch my mapping type from tiled to stencil. And when I do that, you'll see that it actually gives me a stencil here. So right mouse button will move the stencil. Control right mouse button will rotate it. And shift right mouse button will scale it. You will notice, though, that your navigation for zoom doesn't work anymore. With alt right mouse button, you have to use scroll wheel. Unless you change those. I actually have those changed for my own personal stuff. But you'll notice that you could bring the stencil up, and I could go in here and I could sculpt image detail on there. And you see how it's actually sculpting some of that image detail on. In this case, it's quite strong, so we maybe want to turn it down a lot. And you might turn it negative. And you might need more resolution for this, right? So this is more just showing you can do it. It depends on if you've got the resolution for it, right? But you see how you can actually sculpt with stencils, just like you can paint with stencils. So just like you can use view plane for kind of more of a stamping effect, and you can use stencils for painting the exact image, you can use those for sculpting, and it works just like the painting stuff. All right, in this case, I'm going to do that because I really didn't want to add that detail. I can always go back to texture here, X to turn it off, switch this back to view plane or whatever. But I just wanted to make sure to briefly show you that you can, of course, load images in, and you can actually use your texture menu with view plane or stencil to sculpt with images. It's not going to look that great at 1,000,000. I really would have to actually subdivide that higher to really get it to look better. But I wanted to show you at least the mechanics of it, so that if you really want to try for it, go for it. If you don't, it's okay. It's not going to, I don't need you guys to do that for your projects, but I want to show you at least the mechanics of it, and that you can sculpt with images also. All right, I think that's going to be a great place to stop that video.